Well, what a beautiful journey we've been on together, and I hope some of those reflections connected with you. And before we get into wrapping up our journey through the Psalms, and I really get into my Easter message, I have a confession to make. And I know this confession will induce shock for some, and maybe even some shame toward me. This is the confession: that I didn't see the original Star Wars movies until I was in my mid-30s. I know, and to make matters worse for you Star Wars fans out there, the first Star Wars movie, or should I use the proper lingo and say episode, that I ever saw was Episode 1, which you'd think would make sense, right? And I actually enjoyed it, only to later learn that for some of the most hardcore Star Wars fans, apparently Episode 1 deserves to be stricken of all credibility in the Star Wars universe. So who knew? Now, for those of you who aren't Star Wars people, I know this sounds like a ridiculous confession. And to your point, in light of my confession, I hope you can feel that, we kind of get each other, right? Now, I mentioned that this morning because I think sagas like Star Wars and the kind of following they inspire, they remind us that there's something inherently powerful about an epic story. And even if you're not a Star Wars fan, think Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia, Hunger Games, these stories that draw us in on ever-evolving levels. Stories that dive right into the tension, often the deepest struggle between good and evil. And stories that, while normally having some kind of resolve, maybe even a happy ending, they often end reminding us that a hint of the conflict still remains. As though the fullest story isn't quite over just yet, even if you're multiple sequels in. So if you enjoy that kind of epic story, that probably helps set the stage of where we find ourselves as we wrap up our journey through the Psalms. And yet for some of us, I suspect it's going to feel like we're actually jumping into the middle of a story, as that's kind of what Psalm 2, the chapter we're going to look at today, kind of what it feels like. Now, it may seem weird that we're ending our journey through the Psalms with just the second chapter of the book, a book of 150 Psalms, 150 that many of you have read all the way through. But here's what you need to know. It's that most scholars actually see Psalms 1 and 2 sort of like the bookends to the whole arc of the Psalms. That Psalm 1, which we looked at in the first week of the series, is actually like a prologue, almost a prequel to the rest of the Psalms, setting the stage for them. And then Psalm 2 is seen as an epilogue, considering how the story lands and where it may still go from here. So with that context, if you have access to a Bible this morning, I invite you to turn to Psalm 2, or you can follow along on the screen, where we're going to start by looking at Psalm 2, verses 1 to 3, where it says this. It says, "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, 'Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles.'" Now, doesn't this just scream Happy Easter, right? If you're feeling like this seems like kind of an odd place to begin an Easter message, trust me, it was you and me both when I got to this point in my preparation. And yet, don't these opening lines somehow feel like they relate to the experience, our experiences in our world, or the experience of the story of our lives, maybe even on Easter? That while we long for hope in the world, so often it seems like there is so much conspiring around us. Like here it says, "Why do the nations conspire?" Or even a better translation says, "Why do the nations rage?" As though there's all kinds of people, plotting and scheming what they think is best for the world, but no one can seem to agree. That leader after leader of nation or organization rises up only to not fully deliver on all our deepest longings or hopes and dreams. Or here the psalmist says that they even band together against the Lord. It's as though they're pushing against the forces of good, wanting to break free from anything that may stop them. Can you relate to that feeling or experience in our world. This is the tension that Psalm 2 dives right into. And this is some of the tension that you can feel still lingers as we come to the end of the journey of the Psalms. As like I said, Psalm 2 is intended to serve as this epilogue to the story the Psalms are telling. Now, the next section here becomes actually a response to those opening verses, where in verse 4 we read, "The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain." Then it says, "I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery." The Easter joy and hope continues to flow throughout Psalm 2. Well, this next section is describing a divine response to the chaos in the world. And it starts by saying the one enthroned in heaven laughs. And at first, it almost seems as though the divine response is somehow inappropriate, as though God is somehow emotionally attached or disinterested or far removed from the chaos of the world. And that may tap into feelings you've had before, feeling as though, or wondering, is God removed from my experience, from the tension or the chaos that I experience? But as we pay close attention, I think it's actually speaking to the exact opposite. That somehow the God of heaven is not afraid of the conspiracies and the rage. That there's almost a lightness to God's response. It's as though God laughs in the face of danger, that he is not threatened by it. But it also describes a fierce pushback to the evil, saying, I have installed my king. It's saying that a different kind of king has actually been put in power. That a divine king, higher and beyond the kings of the earth, has been installed over and above any and all other kings. And then we see more of this in how the king proclaims the Lord's decree. This is the psalmist speaking in the king's voice of what God said to the king, saying, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. On behalf of the king, the psalmist declares that the king that's been installed is not just any ordinary king, but has actually been identified as the Son of God. It's a bold and profound claim. And here that God has promised to extend this king's reign, not just to a single nation, but to the ends of the earth. And it says that anything that could stand in the way will be dashed to pieces like broken pottery. Now, this last line, it's a reference to an ancient Hebrew coronation ceremony, where as a new king was being coronated, they would write all of the king's enemies, both personal and imperial, on a piece of clay pottery. And then as part of the ceremony, the king would take the piece of clay and smash it on the ground, symbolizing the hope for this king to conquer all of the people's enemies. Then Psalm 2 ends this way in verses 10 to 12, where it says, therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The psalm ends back in the psalmist's voice, declaring both a warning and an invitation to the kings and rulers of the world, and therefore all that they reign, calling them to be wise and to serve the Lord, inviting them to celebrate his rule and worship through the symbol of a kiss, And then the warning and the invitation culminate with two possible outcomes, where it says either your way will lead to your destruction, or blessed are all who take refuge in him. To be warned that the path of chaos, conspiracy, or rage against God is ultimately a self-destructive endeavor, but also to be invited into the ultimate conclusion, the blessing that is available for all who take refuge in this king's reign. That is the Psalm 2 epilogue to the story of the Psalms. And doesn't it feel like the neat and tidy, happily ever after kind of ending that we all long for? Not quite, right? Now, before I get into kind of what does this actually mean for us? What does this actually say to us, especially on Easter? A couple of comments I want to make about this passage is that I know a passage like this, like many of the Psalms that we've read through these past couple moments, you heard some of this in the reflections, it can feel kind of complicated. It's intense. It's even a little bit chaotic in its flow. It can be hard to understand. It's even violent in some of its language. But I want to say that like the epic stories that we find ourselves most drawn to, when we read the Psalms, we need to remember the genre of the Psalms. That these are songs and poems and even stories, all from an ancient culture. And yet, not that unlike the songs or poems or stories from our not so ancient culture, or even not that unlike our experiences in our world from our not so ancient reality. When you think of the chaos and the conflict that can consume so much of our world, let alone our up close and personal lives. And this is the context of Psalm 2 that I think we can absolutely relate to. So then the question is, what do we do with a psalm that still leaves us in the tension? What do we do with a psalm that kind of ends the story, still having the tension linger and only reminding us of the tension or confusion or chaos in our own lives? Especially because if you haven't noticed, despite the prayer of Psalm 2, ancient Israel's long line of kings never fully and finally delivered on the blessing and refuge for all that Psalm 2 ends with. Well, that question, I want us to fast forward in the story a few hundred years from the time of the Psalms to 2,000 years ago from now, to a time when a new character emerged in the story. When a new character came on the scene who people began to wonder whether he might be a new kind of king. A character who declared that the time has come and said things like the kingdom of God has come near. A character who people described witnessing, actually hearing of the voice of God say of him that you are my son. That this character, you are my son. A character who drew people to himself through his healing and his mercy and asked his heavenly Father that all the nations might be his. A character who people then, and frankly people still today, declared as a divine king, as the King of Kings, as the true king over and above any and all other kings. A king who is then anointed, like described in Psalm 2, but not in the way of the ancient kings of Israel who were anointed by a priest. No, this king was anointed by a lowly prostitute and her perfume. A king who was crowned as all kings are, but not with jewels. No, this king was crowned with a crown of thorns. A king that was enthroned not on a royal pedestal, but on a rugged cross. A king who proclaimed his decree, not by threatening his enemies, though, or by smashing their names. No, by declaring, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," as he hung on the cross. A king who conquered his enemies, but not by killing them. No, by laying down his life for them. And a king who conquered the ultimate enemies of all people in our world, the enemies of sin and evil and death, by entering death so that he could overcome it. And a king who we believe reigns today, not by iron-fisted rule, but by supernatural resurrection and the unleashing of his risen spirit into all of the world. Friends, this is the true king of Psalm 2. This is the true king of the story of the scriptures. This is the divine king of the world who has overcome all chaos and conflict through his death and resurrection at Easter. And this is the king who has promised to always be with us, to be with us in all things and every moment, in all of our chaos and confusion. And this is the king who has sent his peace-bringing spirit into the lives of all who will put their hope in him. And this is the king named Jesus, whose resurrection we celebrate at Easter, and who has promised to return again one day in order to fully and finally write the rest of the story of blessing and refuge and restoration for all as the eternal hope of the world. Friends, that is the good news of the story of the Psalms, and that is the good news of the story of Easter that we celebrate today. So let me ask you on this Easter Sunday, what about your story? What about the epic story that is your life? And where are you feeling caught in the tension that is part of our reality, part of our stories, the confusion or the conflict or the chaos of the story you find yourself in? And in the midst of all of that, let me ask you, what are you putting your hope in? Because I think that's the ultimate question of Easter. What are we putting our hope in? Have you been putting your hope in power and politics, where you've been believing that, eventually we will vote in the right leader who will actually make everything all the way it should be? Or have you been putting your hope in money and possessions and stuff, but the chaos of the markets of the last couple of years are making your future feel so uncertain? Or have you been putting your hope in health and wellness and fitness and trying to sort of live the good life, but the older you get, you soberly become more aware that time eventually catches up with all of us? Or have you been putting your hope in relationships? Maybe you've been moving from one to the next, kind of waiting till you think you can find the right fit. Or you've been trying to muster up having the perfect family or the perfect marriage, only to discover that lifelong relationships can be so much harder and often involve more pain than you could have ever expected. If you've been putting your hope in pleasure and entertainment, always chasing the next thrill or trying to numb yourself from the challenges and struggles of life, only to still always find yourself needing more, somehow still coming up empty. Or at the end of the day, have you been putting your hope kind of just in yourself, believing that on your own, you can have what it takes to live a meaningful life. And yet, if you're honest, like for so many, you live with this internal sort of gnawing of a sense of insecurity or inadequacy or incompleteness, wondering if you're just faking it until you make it and that someday you might be found out. Friends, what if these are some of the hopeless conspiracies and vain plots that Psalm 2 warns against? And what if the invitation toward blessing and refuge that Psalm 2 promises is not just some fantasy fictional story? And more to the point of Easter, what if there's a king who has done all that Psalm 2 promises to do and will do all that Psalm 2 predicts yet to come by one day fully and finally bringing blessing and refuge for all? And friends, what if that's a king that we could put our hope in together today? The King named Jesus, who we celebrate together at Easter. This is my invitation to you. And as is so appropriate on Easter, today we have the privilege of hearing the stories of and celebrating the baptisms of 5 people in our community who have recently come to the place of making the decision to put the hope of their story in Jesus, in the person of Jesus and the story of Jesus, putting their hope in the one who died for the forgiveness of sins and rose again to conquer the enemies of sin and evil and death forever. Putting their hope in the King of Kings, whose kingdom of peace, love, grace, and justice is slowly but surely unfolding its epic story in the world, and one day, a story that will be written in full. And as we hear these stories, I invite you to consider your own story. I invite you to consider what if you were to put the hope of your story this Easter in Jesus, the resurrected King that we celebrate today. Happy Easter, everyone.